Hi, everyone. This is Clarissa Sorensen-Unruh, and we're talking about this is another vidcast for our DPL track, and we're talking about self-care today with Sherri Spelic. Is that exactly right? Did I say that?
That's pretty good.
Pretty good.
Spelic, yeah.
Spelic.
Mm-hmm.
And she is who I consider a resident authority on self-care. She has a wonderful book that is called Care at the Core, and I'm going to show it to you because you really should buy it. There you go. And this is on the extension readings, and we're going to read some of it. And she is going to introduce herself now, and we're going to talk. Go for it, Sherri.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be in your midst. So yes, my name is Sherri Spelic, and I teach elementary physical education at the American International School in Vienna, Austria, where I have been for about 25 years, or maybe even a little bit longer. So a long time to be in one place. Thank you. I also tweet and write and publish, and you saw the book, but I've also been blogging for about 6 or 7 years at Edified Listener, and I also started a publication on Medium, Identity, Education, and Power, where I invite other people to write about those 3 topics and to share, and I also slide some of my own stuff in there. Yeah, so it's really lovely to be here, and thank you, Rissa, for inviting me.
Yay! So there's one more thing that I have to highlight because we actually looked at it. It was a resource to explore earlier in the week, and that was the Bending the Arc social justice newsletter for educators. So this is also, Sherri is also the person who puts that together.
True story. Yes, and it's it feels so recent because I only started it last fall 2019. So it's still sort of like, oh yeah, and Bending the Arc too.
And I do that too. Yes. But I wanted to highlight that because we've actually been looking at that.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so I'm going to start off our thought with a quote from Audre Lorde, and just to think about it, and then I'm going to ask you what your definition of self-care is. So her quote is one of her most famous. It's from A Burst of Light and Other Essays, and it says, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." All right. So having said that, you can react to that quote and tell us your definition of self-care, Sherri.
I'm glad that you took that one. I only began reading Audre Lorde maybe last year, actually, that I took Sister Outsider, and I really began reading those essays and understanding.
I love that book.
And the more that I learned about her, I knew that she was a Black woman, but I wasn't as aware of her being a lesbian, of being a parent, of her career as a librarian. And so there were so many elements to her identity that spoke to me, that when I think about that, when I think about what self-care meant for her in her life, I mean, this was a woman who, as a lesbian, but who had also had a straight relationship and had these children, and then later lived with another woman, and so that there was, so reading about her as a person really grounded the words, the famous words, in a way that I felt like, oh, she is talking to me.
Yeah. She was so fearlessly all of herself, all of the time. In a time when it may have been, it wasn't incredibly awesome to be Black always,
For sure.
because of the civil rights movement and all of that, but it definitely wasn't okay to be Black and lesbian, right? It's just it's awe-inspiring how awesome she was. And to be a
Yeah.
parent, you couldn't run from it, right?
Right.
You had to be who you were.
So yes. So
Awesome.
I really, I think about that quote, and it has a more, it just has more layers of meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when I think about defining self-care, what I found is, for me, it is what the things that we do
Mm-hmm.
to become more at home with ourselves. That means
Mm-hmm.
being more at home with who I am,
Mm-hmm.
and what do I need to do to get myself to that place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So what do you do? Let's just go there.
Let's just, okay.
I'm
Well,
just like, why not?
some of the things that, it's interesting to think about some of the things that I do, and thinking about, that for us as educators, right? So much of our professional energy is outward facing.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to do our jobs well, it means that we're also drawing on these massive internal reserves,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that capacity for patience, for compassion, for care,
Mm-hmm.
all of those things need to come from within us. Like, you
Mm-hmm.
can't get that out of a book. You can't say, oh, look
Mm-hmm.
here, oh, look, here's some patience. I'm going to share that with you now. It's,
Right.
that's not how it works, right? You can't go into your lab and, like, oh, let me get a bit of patience. Here, oh, look here. Oh, the
Oh.
compassion, I found it. Oh, I
Great.
I thought it was lost. Um, so
Exactly.
that's just not how it works. So
Right.
given that, the things that I do to sort of come back to myself,
Mm-hmm.
for me, time outdoors is a
Mm-hmm.
biggie. Um,
Mm-hmm.
just being able to, for me, even it begins with just being able to look outside
Mm-hmm.
and see green. That's already like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
okay, all
Mm-hmm.
right. Also,
Yeah.
I think the capacity to step away from things,
Mm-hmm.
just to walk away from the computer,
Mm-hmm.
even in my own classroom. I mean, I'm working
Mm-hmm.
with, kids between the ages of 4 and 11, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we may not agree, and I may need to take a moment.
Mm-hmm.
And
It's a
so I
good
do.
idea. Uh-huh.
I go, and I may have to walk out, go get a drink of water, and come back, which is what I would instruct them to do. Hey, listen, why don't you go get some water? You
Mm-hmm.
look like you need some water and
Would
some
do that
time.
now.
Yes. Here, let me help you with the door. Um,
Oh, also how I
but yeah,
parent sometimes.
as a parent, oh my gosh. Oh, absolutely.
Go,
Do that
just
too.
go
Like,
do that for a while.
right, or here, I'm going to go do that, and I'm going to close the door.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
um,
That's
yeah, so
awesome.
those are some things that I do. And also, I will say, being outside, movement. So
Yeah.
sometimes, if it's walking, if it's jogging, if it's,
Yeah.
lately I've been into balancing, so skating, but also I
Mm-hmm.
have a balance form that I'm
Nice.
really enjoying. It gives me some
Awesome.
opportunities to kind of like train my proprioceptors, and also just kind of like focus in a fun way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I really like everything you said, and I also would add writing to your list because reflective writing, I think, is really important for both of us.
Yes, absolutely. Writing is huge, and it's, again, it's something that, it's such a reflex that I almost forgot. Like, oh, I'm like, oh, I go outside, but actually, particularly under duress,
Mm-hmm.
then I'm going to grab myself a pen,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to grab one of those random notebooks that I have lying around, and I'm going to write some stuff in it, some angry
Mm-hmm.
stuff. I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to talk all about you. I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
say what I need to say.
That's right. That's
But
right.
but then I will experience some degree of relief at some point. It may not
Right.
be immediate, but just that immediate capacity to just let go of some things and to
Right.
release them,
Right.
is so helpful. And what's interesting, it's a release, but then it becomes generative.
Mm-hmm.
That, particularly that stuff
Mm-hmm.
that I really like, I am, I've had enough of this and you and da 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 da. And
Mm-hmm.
I've written it, And then when I've had a chance to step away and come back to it, I think, ooh, that's actually kind of a nice, those are some nice words together. Ooh, I kind of like that. And then I take it and do something with it, put it in my blog and craft it into something else. So that's something that over the years I have found incredibly satisfying to realize, yes, I can have this outlet, but then I can create something new with it.
Yes, and one of the things that I think that you and Maha and some other folks do is you are also incredibly, I would say you embrace contemplative listening. That you both are incredibly deep listeners. You're not just listening to the surface of what's going on, but you're listening to the whole person at once. And it even translates across mediums, like right now.
Which is a miracle to me, actually. I mean, the fact that it really is still possible, even though we are thousands of miles apart, to experience this sense of, like, literally, you are the only person in the room for me, and we are for each other, and it makes a difference on the one hand to be able to do that, but to receive it is a whole nother thing. So it's one thing if you're in the habit of ensuring that you provide that to others.
Right.
It changes the dynamic totally when you are in community with people who are equally capable of that listening, and you are one of those people. I mean, you also have that deep capacity and that those loving ears, right? So it's just the way in which you listen, for me, is also sort of like, and I was saying to my 12-year-old, I was saying, hey, I'm going to get on the phone I'm going to be out talking to Rissa. And she's one of my dear friends, and I can't wait because
it's like a hug.
Yes.
It's like a hug.
But it's because I know I will be heard.
Yes.
It's just that alone is sort of like, oh, wow, yes. Any day of the week.
That's awesome. I have another quote for you because I think it's going to move towards, and that's what I was getting up. So I apologize for not quite being there, but I subscribe to the Center for Action and Contemplation, and they send me thoughtful things every morning. And this morning they were talking about Fannie Lou Hamer. Ooh. And they were the gal who wrote this, her name is Barbara Holm, wrote that according to her friend Virginia Gray Adams, her back hurt and her spirit waged war without proper food or medicine. So when the movement came, and this is talking about the civil rights movement, there was rest. Not the rest that pervades the lives of most contemplatives, but rest nonetheless. Rest as you tell Congress to let your people go. Rest as you testify and lead a delegation off the floor of the Democratic Convention. Rest comes as rest comes, sometimes in the great feather beds of the wealthy, and sometimes just a step away from hard labor. But when it comes, it is a balm to the spirit and solace to the soul. This is the rest that wafts from a wellspring of intentional justice seeking as spiritual practice.
Okay.
I thought I'd do the big ones in the morning.
I literally had chills listening to that.
Okay, so I would like you to react to that, past the chills.
I had literal chills.
Because I think that last line describes you. So tell me about intentional justice as spiritual practice.
What's so interesting to me is that as I negotiate middle age, that I am reminded increasingly of my mother. And my mother was an old mom, so she was 42 when she had me.
Oh, wow.
And so I was late. But my mother was she was actually a social justice advocate and worked with a number of particularly Lutheran organizations. And as a kid, I didn't get that really. I mean, I knew that she was on the board at here and that she had to go to this meeting and that we went to this workshop in the summer and there were always all these justice loving people and I mean, okay,
no,
so
it's like that's how it is, right?
right, yeah, right. As you do, right? The kind of people you hang out with, right?
Of
These
course.
nice Lutherans from across the Midwest, and
Of course, yeah.
and we talk about justice and love and peace, and I was sort of like, yeah,
Right?
okay, all right.
Yeah.
What I did not understand at the time was the way in which my mother influenced those organizations. That that they were, of course, led by white men, and she was someone who was able to, I think, communicate with them in a loving way that allowed them to help move the organization forward. And I wasn't in those meetings. Occasionally I went along to stuff envelopes, but the point is, I think I always had this model of social justice advocacy that was, I suppose, understated, but ever present and committed and unflinching in a lot of ways. And I, as a kid, I didn't understand that. Now, as a middle-aged woman, I understand it a whole lot better. And so when I think about, seeking justice, I know that my own way towards seeking justice tends to be understated, tends to be in the way that I write. That I'm not great with clapbacks. I respond slowly, and I want to take my time and really parse my words about how I respond to something, whether I'm angry or whether I'm I'm devastated.
Right.
But that need to respond and to make plain, this is where I stand.
Right.
And here is where I hope that you can maybe decide to stand with me, but I want you to understand how and why I've chosen to stand here and why it's important that I stand here. So when I think of that notion of rest, that part, that's what's interesting to me there is I think it's the rest that comes in struggle when you are struggling in community. And that community has your back. That's when it's possible to rest in the midst of great struggle and ambition to move your group, your people, your cause forward.
I think you just described some of the best practitioners of the activism that we've seen, right? I'm thinking about the people who are currently heading the BLM movement, and just, they're tireless. They just keep on keeping on. And I think some folks really look at them and say, how do you keep on doing this? How do you keep on every day? And there's still protests going on all over the place. How do you do this every day? And I read an interview at one point that said we're actually making it. It's actually moving. It's starting to move now, right? So that's actually very, very. I don't remember what the word that was used, but it called to mind for me that was almost a resting type scenario. That when I saw movement, I could rest some.
I absolutely. I think when we begin to see change and meaningful change, right? Not the cosmetic change that we're sort of like, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It's
Okay.
like kind of, the cosmetic change that was sort of like Starbucks. Hey, we're going to put race together on you.
Right.
Put that on your cup. Right. But when we see real change and when we see, I think it's Seattle, right? That has said, yep, we're going to transfer those funds. They're going to go from, this much is coming out of the police budget, and it's going to mental health, and it's going to other social services. That's change. That's movement. And you love to see it.
Right.
And we've seen it doesn't come without that forceful insistence.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the
Mm-hmm.
part that I am, again, I'm also only learning it myself, right?
Right.
Because I haven't had
Right.
to participate in the struggle that way.
Right. Right.
But now okay, okay, well, I'll be 60 in 5 years, but okay, I'm coming, here I come,
Yeah.
on my way.
It comes when it comes. I like it. I like it. I think that's awesome. So what is the importance? My question for you next is, while we're trying to do critical pedagogy and we're trying to, or in critical digital pedagogy, and I think the digital world is even harder to do this in, when we're trying to make ourselves available and caring and such, and we're trying to do our own self-care. Talk to me about the importance of boundaries in that work and how that feeds your self-care and how that actually helps your students.
I thank you for that question, because I think I've been using the word boundaries more and more often, especially in the last few weeks,
Mm-hmm.
because I think it has been, I think the pandemic and the way that I experienced lockdown with my family
Mm-hmm.
was truly educational for me, because I learned a lot about myself.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
really, because right, we all have to be at home we have to be at home literally with ourselves,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and that's difficult. That
Mm-hmm.
is challenging. And so what I found was, in thinking about, okay, how am I going to do this? How am I going to manage this in a way that we all emerge from this okay, that we're all
Mm-hmm.
intact, all still
Mm-hmm.
talking to each other,
Right.
that
Our mental
um,
health hasn't gone to hell in a handbasket.
absolutely, absolutely. So when I think about boundaries and self-care, one of the
Mm-hmm.
things about self-care is, because it's a way of replenishing those sources of compassion and patience and
Mm-hmm.
care and all of those things. So in order to preserve those sources, you have to erect boundaries. You
Mm-hmm.
have to. And that's something that we don't talk maybe as directly about that, but this is the part of self-care that requires a particular kind of discipline.
Right.
So
Right.
erecting boundaries and being explicit
Mm-hmm.
about those boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
that takes practice.
Yeah, it does.
It takes
Really big
practice,
practice.
and especially for women,
Mm-hmm.
where we are so often cast in the role of carer and giver,
Mm-hmm.
whether we want it or not,
Right. Right.
that um, that we are, like, it's just, we're just sort of tasked with it. Like, there's the assumption,
Right.
well, of course you're going to care, and you're going to be the, the good cop, or what,
Right.
all of those different ways,
Right.
um, that we are seriously at risk if we are not capable of erecting boundaries
Mm-hmm.
that let people know, no, I can't. And here's the other wonderful piece of advice that I think is so useful. No is a full sentence. Just go ahead and say,
It is.
no, I can't. I'm sorry, but no, I cannot. No, I will not.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. I'm just muting a little bit. I would say, but my wife just turned on the microwave. I don't know if you can hear it in the background.
No.
Okay, good. Good. Yay. So yeah, no, I think that in terms of erecting those boundaries, boundary work is such an incredible part of everything we really do. And it's I think your idea of, as women, erecting boundaries around what you're going to listen to and what you're not.
Mhm.
The whole idea of whether I'm going to take this person's words as things that I should actually think about and talk about, or whether I'm just going to totally not listen to those words because you're not within a circle who I really care about making sure that I've met, kind of your observations and your thoughts in terms of who I am, and I look to you to be reflective mirrors of me. I think Tressie does a wonderful job of that. She
Wow.
really does a beautiful job of being like,
Right. Of uh-uh. Of
no.
uh-uh. And this is very true. And I speaking of, thinking about digital media, the degree to which I have relied on role models. And I have a couple of early blog posts where I really just kind of name like these are the 5 people who have been my role models, who have helped me recognize what I will and will not do.
Right.
And how I may want to be, and how I may need to be. And Tressie is high on that list. And some others, like Reference Davis. There are just some folks at Audrey Waters. These are folks who, from very early on for me, were essential in providing, guidance. How do I how are they handling that? Like, ooh, how, and just learning from their examples.
Right. No,
So
I think that's important. It's really okay. So, how do we? My last question, which until I come up with another question, is how do we break our self-care?
How do we break our self-care?
How do we screw it up? How do we make it? What's the worst thing in your life that you could do to make your self-care basically negligible at that point?
Okay. So what are the things that reliably get in the way of enacting self-care?
Yes.
Great. Thank you for that question.
Sorry.
The things that reliably get in the way of self-care. I want to say, interesting.
Got them.
Ego. Ego. I really think of all the times that I have felt like where I'm really about, more than anything else, fulfilling other people's expectations of me.
Yes.
So I'm trying to perform to show you what a good person I am, how together I have it all, and so that that it would be far worse for me to demonstrate a kind of vulnerability that lets you see that I'm maybe not all that.
Right.
That then I'm going to go hard. I'm going to go hard, and I'm not going to stop until you are convinced that I am the thing.
Right.
And then I at some point I lose it because I can't maintain that. It's not sustainable. And then everybody's disappointed.
Right.
Me more than anybody else.
Right.
So that for me is the case where where self-care really becomes negligent. And it's funny because I think I had a phase where I was a competitive runner. And during that, I think in maybe the earlier years, I used to get very upset when people would ask me, about my expectations, like what I wanted to do in the race. What kind of time are you going for? And and it annoyed me because of course, as soon as someone put that idea in my head, this person is watching to see what I'm going to do, then I felt obligated to beat whatever their expectation was.
Right.
And then I was, lost trying to meet that expectation. I wasn't even running my race. I was running, like a race for 300 other people. What? So I think that experience helped me to kind of recognize, like, oh, that is maybe not productive to the ultimate goal. And so learning to be able to sort of to let go of those expectations, those external expectations, and also the internal expectations, to know,
Yeah.
okay, I've prepared for this race. I know what I need to do. I know kind of what I'm capable of. Let's see what the competition is doing. And I just need to put myself in it. I
Mm-hmm.
just need to make sure that I'm in the race. Like I can't give up from the
Mm-hmm.
beginning because then I'll just be jogging around behind them.
Right.
So
Right.
I do need to, take some initiative and figure out, okay, where do I fit in this?
Mm-hmm.
But without that, but leaving that attachment to all these other expectations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think you perfectly described STEM research, the
Oh,
research race. I think that was the
really?
perfect description
Tell
of
me
how
more.
a lot of people think about their research work, right? It's all about others' expectations and trying to top what you did before. And, as soon as someone says XYZ, then you're trying to make that happen. And there just isn't a lot of room for failure,
Hmm.
which is really unfortunate considering it's science,
It's
right?
so interesting, right? We really only talk about the discoveries,
Mm-hmm.
but not necessarily the process it took to get there. How many
Mm-hmm.
dead ends, how many false
Mm-hmm.
starts, how many, all of
Mm-hmm.
those pieces that contribute to always, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're always learning, like, oh, that's also
Right.
information.
Right. Right. And that
Hmm.
that is there's actually a movement to do, what is it called? Your failure CV or whatever. It's something that shows all of the grants you didn't get and all the all the times that you didn't get something published, or how many tries
Mhm.
it took to get it published, or all of the journals you had to try and get into to get it published.
That's,
um,
I mean, I think there is real value in that. I think
mhm.
there is for
Yeah.
so many of us to come clean would be such a gift
Mhm.
to the wider community if
Absolutely.
we could only come clean about what it actually took.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
think that's part of, I know you're doing the track on in the digital pedagogy lab on
Yes.
digital identity. And I
Yay.
think, and I would love to take that. If I wasn't teaching, I'd be taking it. Um, but I think that it's so important for us to think about these things, because part of your digital identity could be being as authentically truthful about what it took and what it
Yes.
is and where you are.
Hmm.
And but that takes a lot of, I mean, I liked your idea about being vulnerable online. Well, being vulnerable to begin with, but being vulnerable online is a huge amount of digital identity for me.
It is, and I think again, when I think about particularly those early role models,
Mm-hmm.
um, the folks that I read and listened to, and with whom I had the most resonance, like
Mm-hmm.
Pernille Rip, um,
Mm-hmm.
who's an educator, a language arts teacher. She wrote a lot about her children. She
Mm-hmm.
has four children,
Mm-hmm.
maybe five. I don't know, 4 or 5, something like that. But a lot of kids.
A lot of
But she
kids.
wrote about her own children,
Mm-hmm.
and her classroom experience. But
Right.
it was often her posts that were so honest about um, her struggles in parenting, her
Mm-hmm.
struggles with their schooling,
Mm-hmm.
that really I was so grateful
Mm-hmm.
for her transparency, because here for me is this, like she's like an icon in the K-12 edu Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like going deep, telling her
Mm-hmm.
some real stuff about, this is what we're struggling with this child or
Right.
with this. And I thought, wow,
Mm-hmm.
and that was, for me, was so educational. Like, it's possible to be this way online,
Mm-hmm.
publicly,
Mm-hmm.
and to have that be beneficial,
Mm-hmm.
not just for people. You don't even realize in the different ways that it's beneficial for people.
Right. Right. You never even know.
Wow.
You never even know.
Yeah.
This has been a wonderful talk. We're gonna leave it there.